In this video, we're going to continue working in poetry packet number 3. This time, we're going to be working on your imagery poem. So for your imagery poem, you should have it open to this page, Writing Poetry Imagery Poem. And in our imagery poem, imagery is about painting a picture with words. So you're using vivid details that appeal to the senses to describe an event, a moment, an object, or an experience. What we're going to do is we are going to focus on an important event in our lives. So you might want to pause at this point and think about something in your life that was important enough that you would want to describe it in your poem. It can be a positive experience, it can be a negative experience, and can be whatever it is, as long as it's something vivid enough that you can describe it using imagery in your poem. So feel free to pause right now as you think of your event. All right, hopefully you've come up with an important event in your life that you can focus on. And whatever that is, put that in that center box. The one I've decided to focus on for my example is running my first Warrior Dash race. Now, I am going to be describing this event by appealing to the 5 senses. So in these boxes all the way around, I am going to describe as much as I can what that event was like by adding sight details. What did I see during the race? Touch. What did I physically feel, like with my hands? Taste. What did this event taste like? What did it smell like? And what sounds did I hear? And I'm going to try to use as many vivid words and details as I can. So at this point, you will want to pause the video and start filling in as much as possible the 5 boxes. Now you might find that a couple of the boxes are harder to fill in depending on your event. So you might not be able to do the tastes or the smells, but do the best that you can. So at this point, I have my event that I've decided to focus on, and I have filled out all 5 boxes so that I could vividly describe the experience. So I included such sight details as what I saw, like the tall obstacles with tangled nets and the rainbow of runners in their costumes. When I thought of the touch, as in what did I physically feel, I remember feeling oozy mud and scratchy branches. I remember there was hot fire and sharp barbed wire. And I even remember the itchy tulle of my skirt that I was wearing because I was also dressed up in a costume. For the taste, now I had to really think on this one. And I do remember getting mud in my mouth, and it had a very bitter taste, and almost like a salty mud, probably because there was sweat mixed into it. And I also remember the taste of the refreshing water that I got at the end of the race. For the smells, since the race was somewhat in the woods, I remember the smell of leaves and trees, but there was also that smell of the dirty mud that was almost like manure, and of course, the smell of stinky sweat. And then the 5th sense was sound, so the sounds that I heard. I remember the swish of the mud as I walked through it. I remember there being yelling, cheering, and clapping, the thumping of my steps, the thud of when I would fall, and the sound of my own heartbeat. So here I have appealed to all 5 senses as I described what that important event was like. So now I am ready to put together the rough draft of my imagery poem. So on the next page, it's going to start with the requirements. So in my poem, here's what I need to include. I need to make sure that that important event is mentioned in my poem. So I will mention running the Warrior Dash somewhere in here. I need to describe that event by appealing to 3 or more senses. So, even though I filled out 5 boxes on this page, I only have to use something from 3 of them. So maybe I'll use some sight details, some sound details, and some taste details. Now, I could use all 5 of my senses because it says 3 or more. But sometimes, since it's hard to think of all 5, you at least have to come up with 3. Once again, my poem has to be at least 10 lines long. So to make sure that it's 10 lines minimum, I am going to number my lines. And now I know that my poem has to be at least this long. It can be longer, and in fact, there's more room on the next page, but it cannot be shorter than this. And the final requirement is that I have to use 2 other devices from this list. So besides using imagery in my poem, which will come from this requirement, I also have to pick 2 others. So much like I did on the simile poem, I'm going to choose some that I think I'd be good at for adding into my poem. So I think this would be a great poem to use hyperbole. I bet I could exaggerate. And I think this would be a good one to add simile to. So I'm going to make sure I have at least 1 hyperbole and 1 simile when I'm writing my imagery poem. So now I get to come up with the title. I am just going to title it Warrior Dash, since that's the event I'm focusing on. And you can come up with whatever title you want in your poem. All right, at this point, I'm going to pause the video and I am going to write my imagery poem, making sure that I meet these 4 requirements. All right, so here is my rough draft of my poem focusing on my first warrior dash. And as I wrote it, I did make sure that I was fulfilling all the requirements. The first one being that you had to include the important event in your poem. So I made sure I mentioned the warrior dash. The second requirement was describing it by appealing to 3 or more senses. So I made sure that I had something about, I chose hearing, seeing, and feeling. So there was my first sense, my second, and my third. Now I could have included all 5 senses, but I decided I only wanted to do 3. And it says I only have to do 3 senses in my description. The third requirement was that the poem had to be 10 or more lines. I ended up needing 2 more lines, so my poem was 12 lines long. And we had to use at least 2 other poetic devices from this list. Now, when I started the poem, I knew I wanted to use hyperbole and simile. So when I was writing the poem, I made sure I exaggerated. So in the first 2 lines, I used hyperbole. I also wanted to use simile, so I did that in line 6. I made a comparison using the word like. I feel it ooze like viscous glue through my fingers. So there's my comparison. And then I found out that along the way, I ended up adding some extra poetic devices. For example, I mentioned Olympic strength. That is an allusion to the Olympic Games. So I ended up also using illusion. And then here I have tall, towers, and tangled. That t, t, t. So I also ended up adding alliteration. I didn't even plan those two, but when I went back through my poem, I noticed I ended up just using them because I wrote the poem and they kind of just happened. So you might find that you end up using more than two of these devices as you write your poem. And as long as I can find two, you're good to go. So at this time, if you haven't already, start writing your own rough draft, keeping an eye on those requirements at the top of the page, and then make sure that you have the rough draft completed before the next time you are in class, because you'll be writing your final draft when you're in class next. Good luck.